Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity, as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think that's a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. That's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. What indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day. Howdy, y'all. And welcome to another Preparing the Way podcast. Today we're doing another review of a video. The last couple of weeks we did some Galatians, and this week we're going to talk a little bit about the Trinity. Particularly, my compatriot Brad has picked out a particular debate that he would like to review. This is a debate I've never seen, so I will be reacting in real time to this debate, while Brad, of course, my compatriot, will be giving his notes as we review this debate. We're going to talk a lot about problems with, of course, the Trinitarian doctrine as we see it, and as well as in this debate review, give everybody a fair shake and, grade each debater on their actual debate tactics and who comes out on top with the better arguments from an objective point of view, no matter whether or not you're Trinitarian or Unitarian. So, without further ado, I'm going to welcome my compatriot here to the stage. I'm going to swap there we go. That feels a little bit more natural. Sir, how are you tonight?
Doing wonderful. It's been a pretty good day, pretty good restful weekend so far. How about yourself?
Very good. Yeah, I'm just chilling, having a good time. It's been one of those weekends where I don't have a lot going on, so it's nice to just have one of those. And finally, and here's the thing too, for those of you who don't know, I do live in Southern California currently. It has been raining like twice a week since the beginning of February here in the so-called Sunshine State. So first of all, I was gaslit into believing that it only rains like twice a year out here. That is a lie. Don't believe that. The only thing true about this state is the taxes are exorbitantly high. So it finally today actually was a beautiful, like, cloudless day. It's the first time in 2 months that we've had a day like this. So took the bike out for a spin and just enjoying the weather finally. What's funny is we have a joke here in California. It's, that because the taxes are so high, we call it the sunshine tax, right? Like you pay extra because the weather is so nice here. I want my money back.
That's awesome.
I am so mad. Like, that rant over. Let's get to the debate.
Yeah. So, well, before that, I mean, who is with you in spirit? I'm sure we're probably still both drinking something that we've already reviewed, but. Ooh.
I.W. Harper 15-year bourbon. This.
Oh, that's,
as you can see, I've already dipped into it a little bit. It is.
Yes.
This is a bourbon.
Yeah. I.W. Harper, for those of you who don't know, is a very old bourbon distillery, but they are Jewish. Right? The background of the founder of the distillery is Jewish. The I literally stands for Isaac.
Yeah, and he changed his name from like Brashevisky or something super Jewish to
super Jewish name. He changed it to Harper because it would sell better in America. Yeah. And they just make, as far as bourbon goes, they make a spectacular bourbon. I've not had an I.W. Harper that I don't like.
Yeah, this is the second I.W. Harper I've ever tried. The first one was the Cabernet cask for, I think, 12-year. Yeah. But this is a 15-year, and it's fantastic. I'm not even a bourbon guy. I don't like bourbon. You know me. I don't like bourbon. I like this bourbon.
Yes. How
about
I'm doing another old fashioned with Crown Royal because I'm trying to finish that bottle.
Hey, nothing wrong with an old fashioned. I love me a good old fashioned.
Absolutely. But to kind of give a preview of this debate, this is going to be a debate between Dr. Dale Tuggy and Dr. William Lane Craig, both of them very noteworthy scholars in their own fields. Many of you may already be familiar with William Lane Craig. He is a very, very popular Christian scholar, and particularly for his philosophy. Quite frankly, he is an excellent scholar of philosophy. I personally appreciate his philosophical take and his arguments for the existence of God. He's actually spectacular when you put him up against an atheist on the subject of God's existence. He's incredible on that subject. But obviously, I disagree with his position on this particular topic. Dr. Dale Tuggy, also for those of you who have been following Unitarianism, biblical Unitarianism for any length of time, Dr. Dale Tuggy is a very popular name among biblical Unitarians. So these are both very well respected, very renowned scholars within their own fields, and it really was an interesting debate to watch to its completion. For those who follow me on Facebook, I posted a little prematurely because the first bit of it seemed a bit underwhelming to me, but ultimately I was satisfied with the debate. And because both of these men are of good decorum, and I've spent a lot of time talking about bad debate tactics, bad debate habits, bad debate behavior. This is actually an example of a good debate where there is good decorum, where there's good behavior between both parties. This will be an example to actually highlight some good, like, hey, this is the right thing to do in a debate. So I'm excited to be able to do that with a debate for once.
So this is a comment. We were just talking about this backstage.
Yes.
Actually. And I believe you plan on doing a review of that particular.
I will be doing a review of this one. So it's kind of like, I haven't watched that one yet. I saw that it was happening, and I pretty much was already in bed by the time that it was happening. So I decided, you know what, we'll be doing this review, and this will be kind of a teaser to my review of that debate. So that will be happening. I will be reviewing that debate.
I'm actually looking forward to it. I like watching you review debates because you are like clearly a great debate tactician. Like, you're the guy. So like, I know something's up, but you actually are able to put it into words and really articulate well. So I actually enjoy watching you review debates. So speaking of today, like I said, this is a reaction video for me. So I'm looking forward to this because for me, this will be like, everyone, you guys are going to see, this is it. Like, I've not seen this before at all. So it'll be genuine reactions. And I'm also looking forward to hearing about like what Brad has to say as far as this goes. So do you want to go ahead and get this bad boy pulled up?
Yep. Let's go ahead and get it going. Again, kind of how I've done with previous debates, Seamus, if there is a particular point where you want me to stop it, then just say so. But I'll typically we'll probably let them all speak their piece as far as opening statements. Let them go to completion, and then we'll address what they say and whatnot.
Yep, I'll be taking notes. So yeah,
cool beans. This I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of begin it right where, where it begins. So I've kind of skipped the intro here.
First, what is the doctrine of the Trinity?
Okay, thank you, Jordan. The biblical doctrine of the Trinity comprises two affirmations. First, that there is exactly one God, and second, that there are exactly three persons who are properly called God, namely the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This biblical doctrine of the Trinity is simple, straightforward, and logically unproblematic. And this is the view that I defend. The doctrine of the Trinity, as it comes to expression in later creedal formulations, like the Nicene Creed or the Athanasian Creed, involves certain aspects that either depart from or add to this biblical doctrine of the Trinity, and I have no interest in defending formulations that depart from or add to the biblical doctrine of the Trinity. And so it is that biblical doctrine that I will defend.
One follow-up question about that briefly. Are you referring to something like the procession? So like the Son proceeds from the Father or something like that you might find in these creeds, but you're not interested in defending that?
That is correct. That would be one good example of a formulation that is added in later creedal formulations of the doctrine.
Okay. So you have a model that you call tri-personal theism. So can you just describe that model of the Trinity for us?
Yes, it can be very simply stated, and that is that God is an immaterial, tri-personal being. And that's it. No metaphysical mumbo jumbo, no exotic relations standing in for classical identity, no constitutional crisis to maneuver. It's a simple affirmation that God is an immaterial, tri-personal substance. Now, we can flesh that out a little bit by thinking about ourselves. I, as a soul, am an immaterial personal substance, and my soul is equipped with a set of rational faculties that are sufficient for personhood. In God's case, God is a soul who is so richly equipped in rational faculties that he has three sets of rational faculties, each of which is sufficient for personhood, and therefore he is a tri-personal intellectual substance.
But that's partialism.
Okay. Well, at this point then, I'd like to turn to Dr. Tuggy, and welcome again, Dr. Tuggy.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you have published some criticisms of Dr. Craig's model. I know I've listened to some interviews where you offer some critiques. So why don't you go ahead and walk us through, I guess as many as you'd like, if you'd like to raise several or one at a time, however you'd like.
Well, I'm a little surprised that Dr. Craig is distinguishing what he calls a simple biblical Trinity from the creedal view. I mean, most people that defend it, they just mean the Trinity by definition to be whatever the creeds are accurately understood to be teaching. What he said was the biblical doctrine was the claim that there's one God and that there are exactly three persons called God, and that's not a good definition of what the Trinity is. That's something that a certain kind of Unitarian could accept. For instance, in the early modern era, Samuel Clarke or John Biddle. So they think there's one God, which is the Father. So that's one claim. They think there are three persons that can be called God because they believe in the personhood of the Holy Spirit as a lesser being, and they believe in the pre-existence of a Son who's a lesser being. So that type of Unitarian, I call them subordinationist Unitarians. Those would be biblical Trinitarians as he's defining the term. About his view, I mean, the two problems I have with it are, first of all, I see it as clashing with the clear New Testament teaching that the one God just is the Father. If the one God is the Trinity, as Dr. Craig knows, the one God can't also be the Father because the Father and the Trinity couldn't possibly be one and the same. So I think we have to pick here between New Testament theology and these later traditions. Now, when I was preparing objections to his views, I'm going by the views in his book chapter, and they're rather more elaborate than was just stated. One point is, if God has three sets of rational faculties, that would make God just a triply determined person. That's what it would imply. It would mean that he's three persons. In the past, Dr. Craig has defended a view on which the persons are maybe something like parts of God. Although I don't think he wants to use that term exactly. That's different. I'm not sure why we should think there are distinct persons as a result of one and the same soul having three different sets of rational faculties, right? Why isn't it just one being who can think in three different ways? In his book chapter, he divides up the divine attributes, which I think leads to some really serious problems for his view. And I've been reading this chapter for years, and I've published a couple of times on it. I don't think I quite got it right. I'm still not quite sure I have it right. It's actually very hard to understand. But insofar as I understand it, I understand that Dr. Craig explicitly denies that the Trinity, aka God, the one God, is a person, but he does want to say that is a self, the subject of consciousness, knowledge, will, and action, the thinker, the actor. He says that the God, the Trinity, is not a self, but he thinks each of the persons are. But then he tells us that God, the Trinity, is all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good because the persons are. Okay, but if you have a property because somebody else has the property, something else has it, then you have it. And it seems to me, and this is a criticism that goes way back to a piece by Daniel Howard Snyder on Dr. Craig's theory. If you have a property because of somebody else, you have it. You have to be the sort of thing that could have the property. So to be perfect in knowledge and power and goodness, you'd have to be a self. And so it looks like he's got three persons, each of which is a self. And then because they give those qualities that imply divine personhood to the Trinity, the whole in some sense, and it looks like he has an extra one. So I don't understand why he doesn't need four divine persons like my friend Chad McIntosh has in his own unique Trinity theory. And there's other problems that I could bring up, but I think those would be good as a basis for a discussion to start with.
Okay, so I don't want to step in too much. At this point, I'd like you all to have a dialogue back and forth. I think I heard at least three types of objections there, but in case one isn't touched on, I'll bring it up. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to you two and let you begin talking.
All right.
So,
There are too many objections.
All right.
Okay. All right. So
Thoughts?
opening statements. Okay. So he, again, with all the respect that is due to Dr. Craig, he is a PhD. So great respect for that. That being said, that doesn't make him not wrong. And there are things that I have that are problematic already. He keeps saying biblical Trinity. And just definitionally, I have a problem with that because that's not possible. Now that you can say the Trinity is supported by certain biblical texts, and you can even believe in the Trinity. And I'm going to come from this as though I'm Trinitarian, but you can't have a biblical Trinity. Just historically, the problem you run into is the four Gospels, each individually, would present a different view of the Trinity. And then again, there's no language in any of the biblical texts that use this sort of triune nature. The closest you can get to is the divinity of Jesus, but you cannot get anywhere near a triune nature because the Holy Spirit is clearly not treated at all the same way in the Bible as it is later on by the church fathers. So I just have a problem with it. He keeps saying, I'm a biblical Trinitarian. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. You're either, if you're Trinitarian, you fall into some category of Nicene, partialism, Athanasianism, Patripassianism. Like there's you fall somewhere. Subordinationism, as actually Tuggy brings up. Because there is no biblical definition. It's never. There's a reason it's been had to talk about for 350 years before they finally got around to creating a definition.
So I want you to pat yourself on the back here because you basically just encapsulated the crux of what Tuggy is going to end up arguing against him.
Ooh,
right? It's like you hit the nail directly on. He will bring up those exact contentions later in the debate.
Great minds.
And
sandwiches.
So for me, right, I highlighted that too, right? The fact that he says biblical Trinity. But what stuck out to me personally is the fact that he distinguishes this from the creedal trinities, right? So he distinguishes what he calls the biblical Trinity from the Nicene Trinity and the Athanasian Trinity, which would be essentially the Athanasian Trinity, especially the Trinity that is accepted today in the church, more or less. There are some that if you ask them to define the Trinity in their own words, they would actually end up violating and conflicting with the Athanasian Creed in one way or another. But more or less, if you ask them for a definition, the smart ones will tell you, we'll just read the Athanasian Creed, right? So the fact that he distinguishes the biblical Trinity that he believes in and defends from the Trinity that the church at large holds to, it creates an inherent problem for Trinitarians on the basis that, like, one of your greatest scholars who defends this doctrine doesn't even agree with or believe the same Trinity that you believe in.
I think what Dr. Craig has actually done here is defeated his own position, because he said it himself. He doesn't subscribe to any of the creedal trinities, right? Which those are the Trinity. One or the other, that's the Trinity. Anything outside of those are not the Trinity. Those are all heresies. So I think it's interesting that by doing that, he's defeated his own position, and he's admitted that any attempt to explain the Trinity is heresy. That's what he's trying to say. By dismissing all the creeds, he's saying any attempt to explain it at all is heretical, or ultimately will end up being heretical. So he's defeated his own position, interestingly. Right.
And we got a comment here too that is absolutely spot on. It's that he has to distinguish what he calls the biblical Trinity from the Athanasian Trinity, because he said that the Trinity is that it makes logical sense. And if you read the Athanasian Creed, it doesn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Good job there, Mr. Williams.
And part of his position that still doesn't make any logical sense, and Tuggy commented on this, and tried to figure out a way to resolve it, by essentially explaining what we would consider emanation, is, Craig talked about the fact that, we as human beings with a soul have a set of rational faculties, right, that qualify personhood. All right. So then he said God has three separate sets of rational faculties that distinguish three personhoods. That means that these would have to be three distinguishable sets of rational faculties, which
belong
ultimately, right. It ultimately, this first of all, this would mean that they would have to be distinguishable from one another, right? Which creates a level of conflict, because it means that they are inherently different and therefore not the same, right? Because if you have three sets of rational faculties that are all indistinguishable from one another and identical and the exact same, then you have no basis to say that there are three. Yeah, right? You can't say that there's three because you have no basis to distinguish any of them from one another. Okay. And so Tuggy, and I like that he did this. This is good decorum. This is good debate technique, where he addresses a prior writing of Craig.
Yep, I put that in my notes.
And he said, I don't think that I've quite got it right, and I still don't think that I've got it right. In other words, what he's saying is that he's not entirely sure that he has comprehended the complexity of the idea that Craig has outlined, right? And that, look, good on him. That's a humble position to take. It's acknowledging that the concept that Craig is talking about might be complex to a point that he's not really encapsulating it well enough to understand the argument being made, right? And
he almost admits to not being smart enough to comprehend it there, which is giving the opponent a lot of ground, actually. Yeah,
right. It's a nod off of respect to the opponent, and it's something. It's self-conscious in a way that I have outlined before is an absolute necessity to have a fruitful debate, which is to to acknowledge that in order to properly address your opponent's argument, you have to fully comprehend their argument, which means you have to be able to repeat back to them their own argument in your own words in a way that they would agree with.
Yeah. Yeah. My notes I put here. First of all, Tuggy brings up decent critiques, right? Like 3 or 4, and he maintains professionality. He's obviously well prepared. He's commenting on a book that Dr. Craig has written, so he's done his research. And yeah, he actually, as you already brought up, he seems to be doing his best to actually understand Craig's positions, even though he is willing to admit, I don't quite understand them. And that might be, and he's basically saying that could be a problem with me. But I have a feeling that he's going to move forward saying it's actually a problem with the logic.
Right. And which brings me to the other thing, this whole idea of 3 distinctions. You know, he said essentially that in order for these 3 separate faculties to have a distinction, then they would have to be encompassed in something capable of having those, right? Which would be self, definitionally speaking. So it necessitates that these are 3 selves, right? Which, in order for them all 3 to be the same, he said necessitates a 4th. What he is describing essentially is kind of along the lines of what we would call emanation, right?
Yeah.
Where the 4th would be the totality, right? The over-encompassing, overarching umbrella, all right? The overarching entity, the overarching singularity from which these 3, you can't even really say individuals at this point, but from which they emanate.
Yeah.
From
they gather their
singular
source from something. Yeah.
Right. From a singular greater, which is that's the important part, is that this 4th would have to be far supreme to the 3 that emanate from, right? Because this is the source.
Which is something that I believe Dr. Heisenberg has sort of leaned on in his 2 powers theory.
Oh, yeah. Heiser?
Yeah. What did I say? Heiser. Dr.
Heiser. You said Heisenberg, but yeah, Heiser.
Not the drug dealer.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and bring them back up. If you can.
Yeah, here, I got it. Go ahead and hit play.
Play.
Sections there for me to remember. So with your help, Jordan or Dale, we can recall all of them.
I'm sorry for dumping. I mean, the first one is that what you said was a biblical Trinity doctrine. That's not sufficient for being a Trinity doctrine because Unitarian views would count. There's no idea of a tripersonal God in that biblical doctrine.
I don't think that's correct because of the way I formulated the second affirmation, and there you left out a very important word. I said that there are exactly 3 persons who are properly called God. And so the use of the term God to describe lesser beings would not be a proper use in the sense that I'm using it. There are 3 persons who are properly called God. So the divinity that is ascribed to the Son and to the Spirit is the same as that ascribed to the Father. And that would exclude views like Samuel Clarke's and others who thought of Christ as a lesser being than God.
Okay, so maybe you more mean to say that there are 3 persons that are fully divine or something, and that's why they're called God.
Yes, I thought that one might put it that way, but I like to say properly called God because that focuses on the New Testament passages in which Christ is called God, as well as the person of the Holy Spirit. And that when Christ is called God, it's not in some sort of attenuated or diluted sense, such as angels or even the Jewish king might be called Elohim, God in Hebrew, but rather it is a proper sense of divinity that is ascribed to the Son as well as to the Father.
Full divinity, right? I mean, that's not a view that you see in Christian history apart from modalists or Sabellians in the first couple hundred years, right? For people like
Well,
Justin, he's a second and lesser God.
yeah,
Doesn't have all the divine
think that
attributes.
I think that smacks of subordinationism, and I think that I think that this element that was introduced into early Christian theology was very deleterious. So I think a biblical doctrine of the Trinity will affirm that the three persons of the Trinity are equally God.
Well, deleterious. I mean, look, you wouldn't have a doctrine of the Trinity if you hadn't had a couple centuries of Logos theory speculations. Like, that's how it happened. You don't have Trinitarians until deep into the so-called Arian controversy.
Well, I disagree with that, Dale. I know you've said that. I think that you have Trinitarians in the New Testament. I think Paul was a Trinitarian. I think that the author of Hebrews was a Trinitarian. I think that John was clearly a Trinitarian in the sense in which I've defined that term. Now, certainly this elaborated doctrine of the Trinity that comes to expression in the Nicene and Athanasian creeds isn't in the New Testament, but that simple biblical doctrine that I explained, I think, is taught in the New Testament.
Yeah,
and so,
I mean, in my view, there's no way you get equal divinity for the Son and the Spirit in the New Testament, and you also, which we come back to. But I mean,
yes,
you have
otherwise you wouldn't be a Unitarian.
That's right. That's exactly right. But I mean, you have a really weird historical problem, which is you think in the New Testament you have co-equally divine persons, and I guess the implication or assumption that they're one God. And then, by the time you get to Justin Martyr, this is nowhere to be seen, right? It's not an Origin, it's not an Ovation, it's not in the Sabellians modalist, right? But now we get it in 381.
Accurate, but that again is a historical argument that is not germane to the doctrine that I wish to defend.
No, it's plenty germane, because if these were obvious implications of the Bible, you'd have knowledgeable people, like I mentioned, holding to these obvious implications of the Bible, and you don't. So that's a sign that something's wrong. Now we have to talk about passage by passage, obviously.
Exactly.
Author by author. But this is how you know something is wrong, when it pops up in around 381 and a little bit before, and you don't have it really in the intervening period. Well, maybe that's not an obvious meaning of the New Testament doctrines.
That's a question to be decided by New Testament theologians and exegetes. I think that some of these early Christian apologists like Athenagoras, Justin Martyr, Tatian, and so on were misled by this Logos Christology that they inherited from Middle Platonism. And I am not at all supportive of that strand within Christian theology.
Let me jump in here. I think we'll.
All right. Yeah.
That's a really good stopping point. There's a bit to unpack there, and you kind of see, I think, at this point, Tuggy building the case that you already outlined, right? That the subject of discussion here has become, when did Trinitarianism become apparent, right? Was it apparent in the New Testament, or is it something that we really don't see until later on in church history? Whereas Craig is taking the position that it was apparent in the New Testament, right? Because he believes that. Tuggy's argument is, if that were the case, we might have actually seen people talk about it much earlier on than they did.
Which I agree with. The thing is, just the history, right? And I put it in here in my notes, because they talked about it. They brushed over just a tad about the earlier church fathers and the subordinationism. Like they really kind of brushed it and kept going, which fair enough. These are two doctors. They already know what they're talking about. They don't really have to outline everything like we would have to do more normally. But yeah, so basically Tuggy is pointing out that all of the early church fathers that had some sort of Trinitarian view were all subordinationists. And Dr. Craig, of course, kind of comes back with saying, well, yeah, more or less, because they essentially attempted to explain it. But he still argues that the Trinity is apparent before them and in the documents of the New Testament, to which I wrote down, you would not, so obviously I agree with Tuggy here. It's not in the New Testament. And I put a caveat here. You would have to really search far and wide to even remotely make a Trinitarian connection on your own. You really have to pull tons out of it with more presuppositions than your body has room for, kind of thing, in order to come to a Trinitarian conclusion. At best, you could come away with a divine Jesus, but a full-on Trinitarian tri-person God is not something that we see even in the early church fathers. We have a very clear subordinationist, which the early church fathers were all Greek trained. So adding another God to their pantheon, and it was very much used to that kind of language, and felt no issues with calling somebody like the Holy Spirit. Even if they don't think the Holy Spirit is God proper, they have no problem using the same descriptors for God to something like Jesus or the Holy Spirit, because that's just what they did in the Greek culture anyway. They felt that was not problematic, which of course we would have a problem with today. It's a difference in mindset is what actually it kind of comes down to.
Right. And essentially the kind of the problem that Tuggy is dancing around and not really saying in plain words. And good on him for this. He is, again, this is a good discussion, right? They're both being cordial, polite with one another. There hasn't really been much in the way of ad hominem here. Yeah. And they've actually rendered much respect to one another, and even each other's positions. You can tell even though I don't think that he quite understands the complexity of Unitarianism, but William Lane Craig is trying very hard to grant the complexity of the position in his attempts to explain why he disagrees. This is the right way to have this discussion. But what Tuggy is kind of dancing around here is a brief synopsis of the New Testament period to the 4th century, basically. Yeah. And there's really just two ways to look at this, and you really only have it really is that kind of dichotomy. This is not a false dichotomy, either, right? Because what we read from the New Testament, what we can derive from the New Testament, is that there was a lot of disagreement in the early body. Which is why Paul had to write so many letters, right? Is because there is a lot of disagreement within the early body of believers. But Paul never writes on, specifically outlining the Trinity. Like, this is not something that he strains at to explain. And that's because there was no disagreement on this. And that means one of two things. It either means there was no disagreement on it because nobody believed it, right? Or it means that it was so widely accepted by absolutely everyone that there was no disagreement on it. So it never had to be addressed. Now, most Trinitarians would probably lean towards the latter being the case. What Tuggy is pointing out is that the problem with that is that now you have to explain how and why the heretics suddenly come out of nowhere in church history. And then suddenly there's a lot of writing about the Trinity, right? Because it would seem that these heretics who didn't believe in the Trinity just sprang up out of nowhere in history.
Yeah, in like the middle of the 2nd century, with no prior, just like as soon as, basically as a historian, what we see is as soon as the Trinity is thought up, it explodes with writings, and it's nonstop. So, a doctrine so controversial, if it had lived prior to the 2nd century when we first see it, then surely it would have as much writings about it as it does when we first see it suddenly pop up, when we have our first Trinity theory, so to speak, which is actually Docetism, the earliest version, and it slowly becomes modalism instead. And these are the two earliest versions that we have in history. And even in John, in the Johannine epistles, the tiny little John letters in the back of your New Testament, for those of you who haven't gotten that far back there because they're too Jewish, that's quoting Marcion. But he seems to be combating Docetism very specifically, and those are later writings that we have that kind of bleed into the second century. So, if anything, the only thing we have in the New Testament when it comes to writings about Trinitarianism, we see what appears to be an attack on Docetism, and the attack on Docetism, if you read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you will see a focus on the humanity of Jesus. You see a very strong, he is the human. There is one mediator between God and man, the human, Jesus, the Messiah. Like there's a heavy focus on pushing him as being a human. And of course, the Trinitarian will say, well, yeah, because they were getting rid of his humanity in their version of the Trinity. But again, we don't have modalism until later. And then the idea of a hypostatic union, right, is, again, not in this time period. It's not there. So that's not what's being addressed. It can't be. The history is on the side of the Unitarian here.
And that is, so that's the alternative, right? We can observe all of history. We really don't ever find anything that would match this, that whole idea that, well, everybody was Trinitarian until suddenly the heretics came out of nowhere, and then suddenly there's a big dispute about the Trinity, right? That's not how any other topic has ever flowed in history. But what is much more organic, what we can observe throughout history in multiple cultures, right? Just the flow of human nature is... It falls on the other side, that it wasn't disputed in the New Testament because nobody believed in it. And then it became a developed doctrine, right? So this idea of the Trinity was developed, and in its development, it became a subject of heavy dispute. Right? It's a much more organic process. It's something that we can observe happens naturally in human discourse, right? That's it. Again, like you said, history favors the side of the Unitarian.
Yeah, and I have a quick... there's only one area where Paul even comes a little bit close to espousing a sort of Trinitarian view, even according to Trinitarians. This is from Tim Hegg's commentary on Romans, who is himself, he is Trinitarian. It's about commentary on Romans 9. I believe it's verse 12, 9:12. So the Greek is very vague. Long story short, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are 6 different ways that you could possibly render the Greek, and who's talking about what in this passage. One of the ways is that the whole is referring to Messiah and connected to Theos with overall giving, who is God, overall blessed be forever, amen. So that's basically saying Paul is calling Jesus God in this passage. That's one of the ways. And in his commentary here, it says options 1 and 2 are rejected by most scholars, because this would be far and away outside of Paul's usual language and intent, since, as Tim Hegg notes later in his commentary, many commentators, both ancient and modern, have felt that because there is no such direct statement elsewhere by Paul to the effect that he so bluntly calls Yeshua God, that this could possibly be accepted as a viable option for translation. So even Trinitarians have to admit that Paul never once so bluntly uses language that Trinitarians today have no problem using, calling Jesus God, right? Like Trinitarians love to say all the time, well, the language didn't exist yet, the hypostatic union, they just didn't have a way to, express in language the complexity yet, but they all believed it. Okay, so they all believed Jesus is God. They just didn't have a way of expressing that. Then why is it nowhere in the New Testament do we actually have the phrase Jesus is God? You don't have to have complexities for that. That's a simple enough statement. You can explain it later, which the Trinitarians say is what happens, but nowhere in the New Testament do we have the phrase, which is plain and simple, which is a phrase that Christians use all the time in Trinitarianism. So you don't have to have the complexity to make the statement. So why do we have a lack of the statement?
This is again, pat yourself on the back. This is another point that Tuggy is going to bring up. Basically, essentially, that if we give into the idea of progressive revelation, which is something that William Lane Craig is going to ultimately argue for, which we already know that, right? So years and years and years ago, when he was a much younger man, he had a discourse with Rabbi Tovia Singer, where he conceded that the Trinity cannot be derived from the Old Testament because he truly believes in the concept of progressive revelation, right? So he conceded that the Trinity cannot be derived from the Old Testament because of progressive revelation. And what Tuggy points out from that point forward is, okay, if we grant progressive revelation, then the first thing that these people would have done was try and come up with a word to describe what they are talking about, right? To make it easily distinguishable, to make it easily understandable. And especially in the epistles, because we already know that Paul has kind of formed words. Paul has done this. So why he didn't do it with this concept, it speaks to whether or not he actually believed it.
Or why he didn't at least attempt to do so. Even if he could not in his day, there's no attempt made. Again, look up any Christian song. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. These are very simple phrases that Paul never uses. And so he could have used these phrases and let Christians further down the way explain them better, but he never once uses the phrases even a little bit.
Two other points very quickly that Craig brought up is his specification that they are all three properly called God.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And then he talks about, not in the diluted sense of referring to a Jewish king or an angel or what have you.
Right, as Elohim.
That's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that the Hebrew language works and the way that the Hebrew language appears in the biblical text. There is no sense of dilution in any of the examples where Elohim is used in the text not to refer to God. It's not a diluted sense. You have to presuppose Trinitarianism, right? In order for these other examples to be diluted. You have to presuppose that Elohim only and always means to derive, that when it's used in other contexts outside of referring to God, that it is being diluted. That's not an argument that you will ever find really in any Jewish literature, to my knowledge. So far as we know, especially if you were an ignorant person who had the ability to read biblical Hebrew, and you just started reading biblical Hebrew, you would immediately understand that this word Elohim has multiple meanings.
Yeah, this is a
right.
general...
It's none of them are diluted, but that really, at its most basic form, it simply connotes authority, right, and majesty in a sense, right. It connotes lordship, right, or power.
Even whole phrases. In the Old Testament, we have the king of, I think it's Babylon, where he's actually called the King of Kings, which is a phrase that you only ever hear Christians say about Jesus, right? But we actually have a biblical example of that, of a pagan being called the King of Kings. Maybe it was Nebuchadnezzar. I can't remember who it was currently, but the point being that if you ever see a phrase that's not being used exclusively towards the divine, then that means that it ultimately has a diluted meaning, even if it is also used of the divine as a title. And so, that's a good point. You actually have to presuppose the Trinitarian view in order to come away with the idea that, well, just because we call someone Elohim, that's a diluted version of the word. Or we can say that Hebrew is a complex language and Elohim is more a title than a descriptor, right? It's less of an adjective and more of a noun kind of thing.
And this becomes actually very important to understand this when discussing John 10, okay? Because, and this is an argument that I have heard, right, is that, well, maybe you don't believe that Jesus was claiming to be God, but the Jews of his day thought he was claiming to be God, because where they accuse him, you being a man, make yourself God, right? And so the accusation here, the argument is that, well, the Jews of his day believed that he was claiming to be God, and that's why they were going to stone him, right? Is because this was blasphemy for a man to claim to be God. In which case, you are essentially claiming that the Jews are using the word God here, or Elohim, assuming they spoke Hebrew, which the answer Yeshua gives us would suggest they were speaking Hebrew. That you are assuming that they are using this word Elohim in a non-diluted sense. The problem with that is that Yeshua's own answer, by citing Psalm 82, would
Shows that it's the diluted sense.
suggest that being used in its diluted sense, or we can just get rid of this whole idea of dilution, right? That the word can be diluted, and just assume that they were both using the word within its proper context, and that it didn't connote
Like divinity.
Yeah, right?
They could be picking up to stone him for claiming to be a ruler that he's clearly not.
Right.
Which,
Right.
Again,
so that was one. The other one, this is very quick, is that he actually admits, this is something that's very rare for a Trinitarian Christian to admit, but he admits that the later creeds, right, so Nicaea and Athanasius, are a practice in what they call logos theory, and that comes directly out of Platonism.
Yeah.
Right. He admitted that. He conceded that point, which is interesting, and I would almost love to have him back on the show to discuss this, because that's something that Dr. Justin Sledge talked about very briefly, because we didn't really spend much time on the subject. And I don't remember his exact wording, but he essentially said something to the effect of, like, the Trinity is one of the most outstanding examples of weaving Platonism into biblical theology. Not necessarily in a supportive way, but just like amazed at the fact that you could do it. And I would love to have him back on the show to have a broader discussion on the origins of the Trinity and its roots in Platonism, as well as early Gnosticism.
Yeah, that's a good idea. But at that point, though, essentially what he's done by conceding that it's very Platonic, is that this is a purely Greek philosophy that has no roots in Hebrew philosophy, and therefore is not something that a natural Hebrew speaker or a Israelite Jew of the time would have come to the conclusion of, because you would have to then be familiar with a type of philosophy and way of thinking that would be foreign entirely to them. So it's only when the Gentiles with their philosophers' togas on, and then they start to interweave the two philosophies together, which was clearly not the intention of the original Hebrew speakers.
Well, we are about we're 15 minutes and 10 seconds into this video, and we're already almost an hour into our time. So I don't know if you want to plug 10 more minutes of the video briefly, or if we can just close out right now and make this a 4-part series.
Let's close it out, but let's see what the watchers, you guys, put in the chat. What do you want to see? Do you want to keep pushing, or do you want to go ahead and do meme of the week? And
I'm going to cover the rest of this video regardless, but yeah, definitely we could turn this into a 4-part, which we could do over the next 4 weeks, outside of Purim, because Purim is special. We have our special that we do every Purim. And on that note, we will be doing the Purim party, right? I guess we'll call it that from now on, the Purim party, where we kind of just sit and chill, and we have a good discussion with the chat. We accept random questions, right? It can be about theology, it can be about something else. Random questions. And we have a big giveaway. We give away a bunch of books, and we have a grand prize, which is the bookshelf starter kit. It's going to be awesome. some of the same books from last time because we kind of have our core set that we think is awesome that everybody should have. But there'd be some different items on there this year.
Yep. Yeah, we got a few that we've added. So keep an eye out on the Discord or where mostly the Discord. We'll be making the announcement officially on the Discord, the list of books and everything. So if you're not already in the Discord, link in the description down below, click it, join the Discord. If you're a giving member, if you're on our website and you donate any amount at all or through the Patreon, you get special perks in the Discord as well, such as the after parties, which we're going to do shortly after the show. We're going to hang out with you guys for an hour, do whatever you guys want. We can talk about the show. We can sit in awkward silence and do nothing. It's whatever you guys want to do. But we sit backstage with y'all in the Discord. We call it the after parties, like after party.
So I like this idea, Seamus, because nobody really won that. Nobody won that contest to discern how many hats you have. So this is my idea here.
Okay.
You can still win. What was it? Were we giving away a hat or a book?
I was giving away. I think I was giving away a book. I have an extra Tim Heggs letter writer. I was going to give.
That's it. Okay, so you can still win this if you can get the number of Seamus's hats correct before Purim.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think that on Purim, you go ahead and tell us how many hats you have, and nobody wins.
Okay, so if no one gets it, then you'll find out anyway. But I think someone will get it. Everyone, just kind of a heads up in some of the past videos, everyone's been kind of lowballing the numbers, just as a hint. So yeah. Cool. So I think it's time for the meme of the week. So here we go. This is the it's covering the username. Hold on. Mr. Williams. Congratulations. You are the Balami meme, the meme lord for the week. This is
a reference to last week's.
Yep. He made this after last week's episode. And this is good. This is original. Like he created this. This is not a repost, and this is good stuff. And we love original memes. So if you guys are making original memes, they get featured on the show because they're kind of few and far between. But so good job, Mr. Williams.
Also, and we discussed this backstage, there is a previous still shot of Seamus's face from a previous video. I believe it was from one of our recent Galatians discussions, like the old-fashioned style, old-fashioned alternate media, where it's you and me in the same room having a discussion.
Yeah.
There is a still shot from that everybody agreed would make a good meme format. So find that still shot and everybody make your best meme with it. And that will be one of the prizes for the drawing at for Purim.
Yeah. But you got to find it. It's on the Discord somewhere, I think.
Somebody's already made a meme with it.
Yeah. So go hunting
there.
Or just go find that video and hit the screenshot yourself. It's a part where it's I think it's two separate shots where it's me far away. I look into the camera all weird, and then I zoom in like to my face because I heard something super absurd, and so it's like it just gets closer and closer. And someone turned that into a meme format, and it's pretty funny. So if you can come up with the best caption for that format, there's a book in it for you. So
absolutely.
Cool. So I think that's about it. If you haven't already, go buy the book. Link in the description below. It's beautiful. You know you want one.
Still don't have my author copy yet. I've got to just order some. Got to order a bunch.
Yeah, that's what I ended up with finally. Because again, the paperback is available like immediately. It's the hardcover that takes forever to get in. So I just bought a paperback version to have. Yeah, so I think that's it. Yeah, again, links are all in the description below. Visit our website. Members have premium early access to certain articles. We just put out an article that I wrote a while ago. It finally is out. Why wear a kippah? It's an article that I wrote that actually, I think it's pretty good. It has a lot to do with answering questions about 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and the head covering issue. So it's mostly an article about that, as well as giving my opinion as to why I wear a kippah. And if you're a donating member or any member at any capacity, you have early access to that article now, and it will be free in a couple of weeks for everybody else on the website.
Awesome. Well, now that we've got all of the announcements out of the way, it looks like we have a few votes for turning this into a 4-part series. So that is what we will do. We'll turn this into a 4-part series. We'll go over a quarter of this video because it's only about an hour long. Do be looking for my review of the James White and Dale Tuggy debate that recently happened. I may do that as a watch party, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. It'd be a special event. Endure it with me, because it's like a 2-hour debate, but we may just go through it all in one go. And if you guys want to sit and discuss it with me while we go through it, hear out my commentary real time on the spot, I think that's what I'll do.
You need to record it though, because I want to see it eventually, and I might not be able to make it to the watch party because I'm on a totally different time zone. But you should record it so that I can eventually see it.
It will be recorded. So that'll be happening. Right now, I think we are about to go to the after parties, which again, if you're a paying member if you're a paying member, you get access to, and membership starts at $1. Very simple, very easy. You can come backstage with us and have a chat about tonight's discussion, last week's discussion. It doesn't even have to pertain to the show. You can just roast us. Again, not many people have taken the opportunity to roast me. Seamus gets roasted all the time, and I feel left out about that. But, right, Seamus has been made into a meme.
You've been made into an emoji.
I am an emoji. I like the emoji. Nobody knows what it means when I use it, though, because I use it in a lot of different contexts, and it's hilarious. Anyway, that being said, we're going to go to the after parties. We hope to see many of you there. If we don't see you there, we will see you next week with next week's episode. That being said,
L'chaim.
L'chaim.
And yeehaw.